On behalf of my co-authors, Christine Toe, who was unable to travel, and Mike Sharples, I'm really happy to give the presentation today on our paper called Designed to Write. So you know why we chose also to look at the topic of writing. Christine is also a budding writer herself. She does creative writing. I have always been fascinated by the intersection of language and design. And Mike Sharples has been developing educational technology for writing for a number of years for his research. So this is very much in the lines of our own personal interests. So the idea that I want to present to you today is the following claim that we would like to be true, or we think needs to be true, in order for us to be able to demonstrate why it is that design has promulgated, or design thinking has promulgated into so many different fields. And what we think would have to be true is that all forms of communication, such as mathematics, language, or semiotics in general, are all forms of design itself. You may be using different kinds of symbols in order to demonstrate the idea of the design, but all of these are different forms of design themselves. And if that hypothesis is true, then it makes sense that we can see or observe design thinking promulgating across various disciplines. Now, we're not going to be able to completely prove this hypothesis, but I just wanted to show this is the hypothesis we believe would need to be true in order for us to be able to make that claim. So to do that, what we thought we were going to do for this research, actually we were going to do one other thing, but it didn't actually work out because of COVID. We actually wanted to go take a master class with Shonda Rhimes, who, for those of you who watch a lot of her TV shows, she's a very well-known TV writer. And we actually wanted to learn from her how she writes and then interview her to understand how she approaches the practice of writing. But that wasn't possible, unfortunately. So we did the second best. What we thought was we did a book review of this book, which is called How We Write. It was written by Mike Sharples, and our idea was that we were going to do a full-length book review and look at the intersections between writing and design as it was documented by a body of literature that looks at the cognitive, cognitive and social processes behind writing and its intersection with design. So in this book, Mike Sharples makes a few claims for why writing and design are similar, and in his actual language that he thinks are actually pretty much the same. So first he says that mental processes to produce artifacts that are meaningful to others, that is basically what he claims is writing, and this is the same definition that some people would say is a definition of design. That's what both of these activities do, and the mental processes are the same. Both writing and design also share similar process in general and have activities and stages that look very similar to each other. They both have methods and approaches to structure open-ended creative activities, and these methods are also similar. And finally, they both have social processes. They have editors, they have journalists, they have other people who are in the activity, which have similar analogs in design as well. So they have social processes that are similar. In today's talk, I'm not only going to talk about the first three, mental processes, the overall process itself, and methods and approaches. I won't be talking about the third one. And in doing so, I want to elaborate on some of the ideas and research that Sharples brings up in his book and show how they are reflected as well in the design research literature itself. I should also note that although Mike understands and knows the design research literature well, he is not a design researcher himself. And most of the way that this book is written from a perspective of how to write. So what we did is we took his research that he reports that talks about writing and looked at it from the perspective of design research to see where there are overlaps. Okay, so first, let's talk about creativity in writing. So in creativity, the definition that they use in writing is that creative writing, outcomes of writing, must be both original and appropriate. In other words, it has to be written for a specific audience. It has to be able to achieve an intended purpose for that writing, which basically mirrors exactly the same definition of creativity or creative outcomes in design, which is that design should be novel. They should have solution principles that are different from other designs within that category that achieve the same intended purpose. But they must also be useful. In other words, they must actually achieve their intended purpose, just as with writing. So he talks a lot in his book actually about different mental processes that are associated with the practice of writing. And he uses this language, what he calls cognitive pathways. And when he talks about cognitive pathways, and as we read it, we were struck by the similarity with which he describes this and what is known as CK theory, for those of you who are familiar with this specific theory of design. So he starts by saying that writers begin with this tangled web of associated concepts. That's a direct quote from his book. But that what they have to do then is they have to organize those conceptual spaces in some way. And to us, that sounded very much like the concept space in CK theory. But then writers also have to be able to take all that tangled web of concepts and organize them according to some internal and external constraints. So internal constraints relate to the story or the narrative that the author wants to communicate. The external constraints may be style guides that the writer must conform to. So for example, if you write for the New York Times, you have to utilize the New York Times style guide, and those become external constraints on the way that you write. And so what the writers have to do is they have to apply what's known to be true or false about language, grammar, or style, or whatever that happens to be, to convert those concepts into some externalization, which is the knowledge space in CK theory. So when he writes about that, he doesn't actually use the language from CK theory, but he may as well have been referring to CK theory, because he exactly talks about this transformation that happens between the conceptual space and the knowledge space in CK theory, which is how writers invoke these conceptual spaces relevant to their task, and then they explore and convert them to create products that the writer could not have imagined previously. I'm sorry, sometimes I will say the word designer when I know I'm reading the word writer, because the words are almost identical, and even when he says things like he wants to create products as opposed to creating a written work. Okay, so that's a little bit about mental processes, and he goes into a lot much more detail, and we talk about some of that detail in the paper. The second one that he talks about are the methods and approaches that writers take in order to craft their writing. And they, of course, go through several stages, such as planning, composing, and revising. But the one that struck us the most was this idea that writers have to have some experience, in other words, their own particular point of view on a topic. They have their own internal schema about that topic that they're trying to communicate. Then they will have to express that in some written language, in some style that they must conform to, for example. But they are doing so while thinking about the ways that readers are going to interpret the schema that they have in their own mind. And to us, this is exactly what Don Norman has been talking about of mental models, and the fact that we as designers, we have to create designs that to some extent mirror the mental models that we have as designers and the mental models of people who are interacting and using products, because we want to be able to make sure that the mental model that we have of the design matches the mental model of the eventual users who will interact with that. So even in this notion of writing and actually composing, there is this language of matching mental models, which is a very, very important concept in the design of physical and interactive products. And finally, he doesn't, again, utilize the language of reflective practice, but in talking about planning, composing, and revising, he talks about this reflective conversation with text, that writers are constantly looking at what they're writing, and I think in John's language, they are discovering things about their writing as they are doing their writing. In other words, it's not a pre-planned, pre-executed text that they're creating. It is text that's being discovered as they're going through the process of writing. So in their methods and approaches that he talks about writing, we see a lot of similarities with what has been said in design research, talking about mental models, but also about the reflective practice, which has been a very predominant paradigm of design and design thinking. Okay, so basically, he goes through a lot of, there's a lot of more that goes on in the book, and eventually he leads with the hypothesis that writing is actually a process of design. And if that hypothesis is true, then writers are ipso facto designers. In other words, writers are basically acting as if they were designers. And it turns out that in his book, he also recommends that the process of designing is actually a productive way of approaching the process of writing. In other words, if you want to be a successful writer, you actually should practice the methods of design to allow you to be more effective as a designer. So he's not saying that writers themselves are designers in the language that Gabby was saying, but he's saying they're ipso facto acting as if they were designers because they're using mental processes that look very, very similar to what we call as mental processes in design. They're using activities and approaches that we would characterize as these sound like very much design activities. And then they are using structured approaches that also, again, look as if they're executing on a design process. But in their case, it happens to be that they're creating a written text as opposed to, let's say, a physical form of some sort. Okay, so if this theory is true, what does that necessarily mean for the practice of design? Well, the small implication is that therefore we can share theories and methods from writing research and design research. So I'm sure that there will be some presentations today, but again, I'm kind of, because my chair is John, I'm thinking about John's research as I was preparing my talk. And I'm thinking, if John is looking at neural correlates of design, we should be able to observe very, very similar neural behaviors when people are writing as if we were asking them to design. So in other words, we should be able to borrow some of those findings from neurocognition of language to look at, and language construction, to look at the kind of neural behavior that we would expect when people are designing. While that's a small implication, I think it actually would be able to help advance the field by being able to identify the similarities between these two activities. But the bigger implication, the one that draws much more of our debate and questioning, is that the designing or design thinking, therefore, is really a building block for the intentional creation of cultural artifacts. And that means that it encompasses all forms of artifact-mediated communication. In other words, anything that has a symbol that allows us to mediate communication must have been a process of design. A process of design would have had to be involved in the creation of that artifact-mediated communication. Just because we had not observed it, or we haven't bothered to observe it, or that it was latent possibly, does not mean that that design was not present while that activity was happening. So that's for us, we think, is the bigger implication. So therefore, the big conclusion would be that if all forms of communication, such as mathematics, for in this building, then it becomes possible to cast many disciplines as a form of design. Again, we're really careful here to say that we're not saying that all these disciplines are design disciplines, but what I think we are trying to say is that many of these disciplines are utilizing, maybe not knowingly so, methods and mental processes that are associated with design without having acknowledged that they were necessarily using a design approach in those disciplines. So our big takeaway is that we think, of course, that design thinking is a unique and powerful mode of thinking that can be utilized by many disciplines and is, can be, for example, like mathematics, which is used as a central language for science, engineering, economics, and many other disciplines. And it's really still just very early days that we're starting to use design and design thinking as a language for us to execute on these creative processes that are associated with the production of cultural artifacts. So Christine just wanted me to include and conclude on the last slide. And I guess it was kind of fortuitous. We did not actually know that the School of Architecture at Technion is in the same building as mathematics. But she wanted me to end on this slide, which is an example of mathematical thinking, which I think has many more years of research than design thinking is, which are on the verticals. These are all the different types of thinking activities that are associated with mathematics. And on the horizontal, these are the things that people typically have to learn in mathematics. And what are included inside here are different prompts that educators can use to help students to develop specific thinking capacities that are associated with specific activities that are happening in mathematics. And so her challenge to us now, moving forward, is how can we come up with a similar set of specific thinking processes that take place in design and specific things that might have to take place in designing. By the way, we included writing here just as an example, that we would have to be able to fill in this table to really explain the ways in which design and design thinking intersect with different sorts of activities that are involved in the creation of cultural artifacts. And with that, I finish.